Hi, everyone. I'm Rosemary Miller here with Kelly Phillips Erb, a senior writer here at Forbes, here to tell us about one tax bill advancing in Congress while Republicans introduce a new tax proposal. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kelly.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Kelly, what are the key provisions of the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act of 2024, and how does it aim to impact bonus depreciation, the employee retention credit, and the child tax credit?
So the things that you've mentioned, those are sort of three of the highlights of this bill. It's actually a pretty extensive bill for the time of year that they introduced it. Tax season opens on January 29th. And the tax bill hasn't been pushed through yet. So if it makes it through, a lot of these provisions would actually impact the tax filing season. One of the things that you mentioned, the child tax credit, is something that's always been around. It's been in the tax code for a while, but during COVID, we saw a little bit of a boost where families could get more money back. And studies have shown that that actually helped reduce child poverty because that particular provision is targeted to lower and middle class families. And so it got a big boost, but then it went away after COVID. It reverted back to where it was before. This new tax deal, as part of the overall provisions, would actually restore part of that expanded child tax credit. So it would be the same credit on the books. It's not going away. It would just be a little better than it was before. Maybe not quite as good for families as it was during COVID, but this is a negotiation, right? So it is what Congress kind of hammered out. Some other provisions that are in the code, you mentioned bonus depreciation. One of, I think, the key, maybe, I don't want to call it a negotiation point exactly, but one of the things that are giving some lawmakers hesitation is that they feel that it's very heavily favored, the deal towards corporations. And that is certainly the case, that there are a lot of tax breaks that would benefit corporations. Bonus depreciation is one of them. And the short way of thinking about bonus depreciation is that normally, as a business owner, when you buy equipment, you have to what's called expense it, which means that if you buy something, the government has decided that maybe a computer should last you 5 years. So even if you pay for it in year one, you have to only take a little bit of a deduction every year until its useful life is over. So maybe 5 years or whatever that number might be. Under bonus depreciation, you can and immediate expensing, two of the provisions that are in this bill, you would be able to deduct that all at once, subject to certain limits, and that's really beneficial for corporations. So there's a few corporate tax breaks, a few corporate tax breaks, and a few breaks that are geared towards families. So that is probably why that particular bill is going to advance. And why it did get out of the House Ways and Means Committee with a pretty healthy vote. It was 40-3, which is pretty impressive in this particular Congress to have that level of agreement. But it would bring some relief, I think, to families and companies, which is what Congress is hoping for.
So, you kind of touched on it, but could you elaborate on the bipartisan support in opposition to the tax proposal?
Right. So I think, generally, Congress hasn't done a whole lot to move the tax needle since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I mean, there's been some appropriations, some spending, but in terms of real tax change, this would be one of the first, I think, significant breaks we've seen, especially since COVID, right? And so there is, I think, some appetite in Congress for doing something because they haven't done a whole lot. But there's a divide as to where that should be. So I mentioned that the vote was 40-3. The three members of Congress who voted in opposition were all Democrats, and one of them in particular mentioned that he felt that it was Doggett who said that he felt that it was too heavily skewed towards helping companies and not nearly skewed enough towards helping children. So I think that's where you're going to see the divide, and why there's a little bit of hesitation to completely push this through is that there's always going to be one side that's going to say why isn't there more for me, and so there's where we're seeing this divide, right? Should it be more corporate friendly? Should it be more child friendly? The fact that it's bipartisan, I think, especially when you look at the numbers, I think does indicate that there definitely was a compromise, right? Like it is not all towards families or all towards corporations. So there is a little bit of hesitation, but I think overall it's probably the best deal that we could get out of this Congress.
So, Kelly, how does the Penn-Wharton budget model assess the cost and impact of the White and Smith tax proposal, especially in relation to the early end of the ERC program?
So what the Penn Wharton budget model did was they took a look at the cost of this bill, what it would cost to expand the child tax credit, for example, what it would cost to do the bonus depreciation, what it would cost to do some of these other breaks that are in the bill, and how much would this cost the taxpayers over 10 years? And what they found is that this would cost more or less, it's going to be about $80 billion, the cost of this bill. That's not something in this particular Congress that's really focused on, cutting spending that people are excited about. So they had to think about a way to offset that cost. And one of the ways that they're going to do that is through ending the employee retention credit program early. And the Wharton model found that it would probably, not completely, but it would probably mitigate that cost significantly. It depends. The numbers are sort of fuzzy because the program is still going on, but they anticipate that the bill would, once you factor in that early end to the ERC program, only end up costing taxpayers around $3 billion, which is a lot more palatable than the $80 billion that was posited before. So, models are exactly what they are, right? Like they're estimates of what could happen. So no one can say for sure. There's a lot of fraud in that ERC program. How much of it's legitimate versus how much of it's fraud is still being sort of worked out. But that's where the numbers are landing. They're saying that more or less cutting that program early will actually offset largely the cost of the bill otherwise.
Well, the House is, they're going to vote on the tax proposal when? Next week, the week of January
Hopefully.
29th.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully. Okay. Well, what
Hopefully.
challenges and considerations might influence the outcome of that vote?
So I think the House is going to be interesting because you have, of course, the Freedom Caucus that immediately expressed unhappiness with the bill. Well, certain members of the Freedom Caucus did. A lot of folks who are on the more fiscally conservative side consider it a giveaway. And then, as I mentioned, you have folks who are on the more fiscally liberal side that say it's not enough for families. So that's going to be, I think, one of the challenges, right? Getting those folks to agree on that the deal that's been pushed out so far kind of satisfies both of those requirements, right? And I think you're pretty much going to see that. The problem is that there's a really I don't think that the problem that we're going to have is in the House. I think we're going to see a bigger problem in the Senate. One of the things when Wyden and Smith pushed this out in the beginning, they said that they wanted to have it done before tax season opened. So tax season opens next week, January 29th. Which makes it a real problem because they haven't even scheduled votes in the House or the Senate yet. So I think one of the challenges is going to be trying to garner support for something that is already going to start leaking into tax season, because once tax season starts, it's going to put the brakes on some of the prep, right? Because if you're thinking, I might have an expanded version of the child tax credit, IRS has to go back and change forms. For all of these breaks, that there's going to have to be some modifications either by the IRS or by tax preparers. So I think that the closer we get to tax day, and then once tax day passes, the further away we get, I think there'll be less appetite for pushing it through.
Well, Kelly, shifting focus to the Death Tax Repeal Act introduced by House Republicans, what are the main objectives of this legislation and how does it aim to impact family-owned farms, businesses, and the federal estate tax?
So the federal estate tax is really an interesting tax for a lot of reasons. It actually impacts a very tiny percentage of Americans. They've run some numbers. The IRS, the last data set that they ran, I believe that's complete data, is from, I believe, 2019, somewhere around there. And of the 2.8 million people that died that year, there were only about 2,100 estate tax returns filed. That doesn't necessarily mean people who paid. It was the number of returns that were actually filed. It's less than 1% of Americans who will actually pay estate tax. That being said, it's still an incredibly unpopular tax, right? So the Republicans in particular have long sort of championed the demise of the estate tax. Ever since, you can go back all the way to the Bush years, they wanted to get rid of it. It's been a difficult tax to get rid of for two reasons. One, it does make money, not a ton of money, but it does raise some money. And two, it impacts just a few people. But that doesn't mean that the tax is popular. And so for that reason, there have been several proposals to get rid of it. They almost always fail. The closest we ever got to getting rid of it was in 2001 with what's called the Bush tax cuts. They actually did eliminate the tax for 1 year. So in 2010, we didn't have an estate tax, but then it came back in 2011. When you look at the exemption amounts, they're very, very high. And what the exemption amounts mean is it's the amount of money, the amount of assets that you can have before the tax applies. And for 2024, that's over $11 million. For a family, it would be over $22 million for a married couple. So when you start looking at those numbers, most of us don't have that kind of money. It doesn't impact us. So we're not on the phone calling our congressional officials saying, get rid of this. That being said, as you mentioned, small business owners in particular don't love this tax. And there have been a lot of calls from certain business sectors and certain farming sectors to get rid of it. However, it is worth mentioning that when you start looking through some of the literature and the stats, proportionately, especially on the farming side, because of some of the opportunities for mitigation that are available under the code, it's very few people that are actually impacted. So there's a lot of belief that this is probably just another, I don't want to call it a stunt because that's not quite fair, but it's not likely to pass. So it is more raising awareness, I think, than an actual serious proposal. I mean, the proposal itself may be serious, but the chances of it getting through are quite slim.
Well, you kind of answered my final question I had for you. I want to know, what are the next steps for both tax proposals in terms of the legislation process, and what kind of impact could these proposals have on American taxpayers and businesses if enacted?
So the on the death tax side, that one has to get out of committee. It's still in committee, so that's why I don't anticipate that it's going to go far. However, the other bill, with the child tax credit and the ERC and the bonus depreciation, that has gotten out of committee. It got out of the House Ways and Means Committee again with a 40-3 vote, which is very encouraging. So the next step is that it needs to go on the floor and get a full vote. So we'll see. First of all, when and if that happens, hopefully we'll see some movement next week, one way or the other, so that taxpayers and tax professionals will know how to start off the season, knowing whether they should slow down a little bit and see what happens, or if they have some certainty. Otherwise, I think it's a wait and see game.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. You are phenomenal, as always.
Thank you.